The next thing that's going to come up though is right now we conveniently have four different cities in the same way that we have four different rectangles and four different circles. But what happens if I don't have four? What happens if I have, five different cities or 100 cities or one city and maybe not the same amount of rectangles? So what I'm going to do is I deleted one rectangle. I'm going to save and I'm going to refresh. So we don't get any errors. We have the same three rectangles we had before. We're just missing that fourth one. So all that seemed to happen was we said, hey, get all the rectangles. It got all three rectangles. It attached the data to them. So it attached the first rectangle got the first data point, second rectangle got the second data point, third rectangle got the third data point, and then the fourth data point was just kind of left alone. And then we said, hey, go fill in the width based on the population. So the first rectangle got to do that, the second rectangle got to do that, and the third rectangle got to do it. The fourth one didn't because there is no fourth one. If we had one extra rectangle, so I'll push it down a little bit more. So let's say we have a fifth rectangle down here. It's just black because all that's happening is we're saying, hey, find all the rectangles. Finds all five rectangles. Says, hey, attach one city to each rectangle. First rectangle, first data point, second, 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 or third, third, fourth, fourth, and then the fifth one just doesn't have a data point. And so then it goes through this situation, and guess what? There is no population, there is no D for this final data point. So it's just lost and alone, and it doesn't have anything to work with. Now, in the real world, you never get anything drawn for you. You do not first go through an SVG and make rectangles or circles for every one of your eventual data points. Because honestly, if you have a scatter plot that has 100 circles on it, you don't want to cut and paste circle 100 times, right? All you want to do is just say, D3, take care of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete every single one of those rectangles. Delete them all, refresh. There's no error, but it's just when D3 selected all of the rectangles, it got them all, and it associated all of them with data, but it just so happened that because there weren't any, as you do all of this, this doesn't get run. There's no rectangles to fill, there's no rectangles to set the width for, they're just sad and lonely. So what we want to do is we want to say, hey D3, find all of the rectangles, give every single rectangle a city, and then for every single lonely data point that doesn't have a rectangle, I want you to add a rectangle to the page. So we're saying find all the rectangles, give each of them a city, and the cities that do not have rectangles, add a rectangle to the page. And you say, so why do you not type it like this? And I say, because this looks nicer, because you always do enter append at the same time. The big D3 pattern is select all data, enter append. And you just can't get used to seeing it on the next line, even though we're going to end up doing that next week. So save, refresh, and sadly, it doesn't work. I pitched this as the solution to all of our problems, but it didn't seem to work. What we're going to do is we're going to inspect this whole page. And we're going to look inside of our SVG, and we're going to see a bunch of circles, but we're not going to see any rectangles. That's because all of our rectangles are hiding out here. When we said D3 find all of the rectangles, and then add a rectangle for every lonely data point. What we didn't say is where they should go. Now, we know that you have to put SVG things inside of an SVG tag in the same way that you have to put CSS inside of a style tag. Otherwise, you can't see it. So what we actually need to do is say, hey, take all these rectangles and put them inside of SVG. The way to do that is to say, D3, I want you to go find the SVG that's on the page. And inside of that SVG, I want you to find all of the rectangles. I want you to bind data to them, and then add a rectangle for every city that is missing. And because we first said, go find that SVG and only look for rectangles inside of that SVG, when we refresh, we are now going to have rectangles inside of our SVG. The problem is, though, that they currently don't have a height, right? They don't have a height, and they're probably all going to be positioned on top of one another, but we'll fix that one at a time. So first off, we can give them all a height. Now, in a bar chart like this, currently they all have different widths. Do we want height to be the same for every single one of our bars, or do we want the height to be different for every single one of our bars? The other way of asking this question is their height dependent on their data? And the answer is no, because we just want a boring bar chart. So the width changes, but the height stays the same. So let's just say 20 pixels for each of them. If the height were different for every single bar, we would do function D here, but because it's going to be the same, we're just going to say height 20. Save, refresh, and if we mouse over it in the inspector, we can see, okay, sure, they all have different widths, but we just need to space them out here. I'm going to set them all to have an x of 0, so they all line up on the left-hand side. Even though they're there by default, it will make me feel better about myself. What we need to do now is we need to space them out on the y-axis. So in order to space them out on the y-axis, we need another scale. Now, the scale we're going to use, what are we going to call this if it's going across this axis here? Well, this is the y-axis, so I'm going to call this the y-position scale. The kind of scale this needs to be, if we went through our list of scales, is it's going to be called a scale band. So here, we'll go through the notes for this. So if we were spacing out circles, the circles on the right-hand side, we would be using a scale point. But in this case, we are using a scale band because we are spacing out bars evenly on an axis. So we're going to say, okay, we need to give it a domain. We need to give it a list of all of these names, because that's honestly what we're spacing them out based on. We're spacing them out based on your New York City, your Tokyo, your LA, your Brooklyn. We could do this manually. NYC, Tokyo, LA, Brooklyn. You know, this might actually be nicer if we saved this as names. So var names equals that. So we're saying we're going to give you one of these names. We're going to tell you we're New York City, or we're Tokyo, or LA, or we're Brooklyn. And in exchange, you're going to give me a number between, let's say, 0 and 300. Why not? So this exposition scale, it's going to take one of these names, and then it is going to space out our bars on the y-axis. So if we go down to our rectangles, Okay, what attribute do we want to change? We're looking at this axis, so we're going to say ATTRY. Do we want it to be the same for every single data point or different for every single data point? Because it is different, we're going to change it to function D. Now, what scale are we going to use? We are going to use the Y position scale. And what column is the Y position scale interested in? It's interested in name. So, as long as we always have function D, as long as we're always using, D dot the column, as long as we always have a scale that we can use, your code is going to look remarkably similar every time you do this. Save, refresh, and there we go, it evenly spaces it out. If you want to get really crazy, if you look into the details of scale band, we are manually setting the height right now. So we set it to 20, we could set it to 30, make it a bit bigger, 60, a bit bigger. We're not sure exactly, if we wanted these to line up with one another, how far apart they should be. But if you say Y position scale dot bandwidth, this is actually how wide each one of these is. And there we go. You can also change other things. I think it's not padding, outer spacing, inner spacing. Let's see what happens if we do padding 0.5. Oh, there we go. So padding spaces on the inside and outside. I think it might be inner padding and outer padding if we just want to do it on one side. No, who knows what it is. But for now, we can just stick with all of them have a height of 60, or all of them have a height of 30. So this is what you want to do. Every time you have a bunch of data points and you want to add let's say a rectangle for every single one of our data points, first you have to make sure you have no rectangles already in there. Your next step is you're going to say D3, find my SVG that's on the page. Inside of that SVG, I want you to find all of the rectangles that exist. Take those rectangles and give each rectangle a data point. After you've given it a data point, if there are any data points that are lonely, that don't have rectangles, please add a rectangle to the page for every single one of them. Then you're going to do your positioning, you're going to do your styling on all of those rectangles. You're just going to have to watch out because usually they're going to end up lying on top of each other, and you'll be very sad and you'll be very confused. But you'll just want to make sure that you always, always, always use the web inspector. Make sure your circles or your rectangles are always appearing inside of the SVG. Make sure they have all the necessary attributes they need, x, y, height, width, cx, cy, r. I guarantee you, when you start working with circles, you're going to forget it's cx and cy, and instead you're going to do x and y, and then they're all going to be stuck in that top left-hand corner. You're going to be terribly, terribly confused. But yeah, that's how you add a visual element to the page for every single one of your data elements, and then fix them up after you've built hundreds and hundreds of scales.